So yes, my topic today is the history of magic. On the 16th of April 1872, in the Barley Mow pub in Wellington in Somerset, a series of objects fell out of a chimney, and this is an account by E.B. Tyler. In a low cottage ale house there, certain men were sitting round the fire of logs on the hearth during the open hours of a Sunday afternoon drinking, when there was a gust of wind. Something rustled and rattled in the wide old chimney, and a number of objects rolled into the room. Now, this is one of these objects, which is currently in the collections of the Pitt Rivers Museum. This you may or may not recognise as an onion. The onion has a sort of spring through the middle of it, and pinned to its outside is a piece of paper. And on the piece of paper is a name written, Joseph Hoyland Fox. Joseph Hoyland Fox, as it happened, was E.B. Tyler's cousin, Tyler being the father figure of anthropology in this country. Fox, like Tyler, was a Quaker and had engaged in a campaign to try and get the Barley Mow pub closed down as a low cottage alehouse, as Tyler said. He and three other people had onions with their names pinned to them stuck up the chimney. And it's almost certain that Samuel Porter, who was the landlord of the pub and who had a local reputation as a wizard, put these onions up there with the general idea that as the onions dried out, harmful things would happen to the people named on them. We happen to know through Tyler that at least in Fox's case, nothing unpleasant happened to him, but the intent was there. Tyler was rather shocked when he discovered these onions, when the onions were reported to him, mainly because in his view, and this is E.B. Tyler, large bearded Victorian gentleman, mainly because in his view, magic was, as he would have termed it, primitive belief that died out in Britain many years previous and only existed in parts of the world where one would expect such beliefs to happen. And for Tyler, the intellectual history of humankind moved from a belief in magic to a belief in religion to a belief in science. And human progress, of which Britain at that time was at the peak, the acme of progress, was a scientific, a rational country, and one in which magic should have died out. So the fact that these onions were evidence of magical practices, and then there's a whole series of other things. There's a witch ladder also from Wellington, and various other things from Somerset, which are now in the Pitt Rivers Museum, caused Tyler to think deeply about the nature of magic. Not that he really changed his mind very much. And this notion that magic is dying out came through the 19th century into the 20th century. So Max Weber, the famous sociologist, said that to be modern was to give up a belief in magic. Modernity was all about disenchantment, the loss of magic in the world. And this fantastic book by Keith Thomas, 1971, Religion and the Decline of Magic, as the title implies, charted magic dying out through the late medieval and the early modern period. The interesting thing about this book, oh, my slides have disappeared. The interesting thing about this book is that, I'm hoping they'll come back again, is that right at the end, Keith Thomas says that, in fact, magic does seem to be alive and well in many areas of Britain. So although we've previously had several hundred pages of magic dying out, at the end, there's equivocation about magic perhaps being around. My argument, unsurprisingly, is that magic hasn't died out, and that many people in the world today, including in Britain, other areas of Europe, have a deep and ongoing belief in magic. and that magic, just like other elements of human life, has a history. One of the crucial first questions about magic is, what is it? So I take my definition from the French anthropologist Lévi-Brühl, who said that magic is human participation in the world. So in this idea, we're looking at a notion of human connectedness, that there are direct links between human beings and the world in which they live, such that if you put an onion up a chimney in a pub and put someone's name on it, it can harm the person. So in ways that wouldn't be allowed for in a scientific worldview, for instance. And Lévi-Strauss, a later French anthropologist, also said that magic is a humanization of the universe, so that magic opens us up to the universe and the universe up to us. So there's a continuity for people with magical beliefs between us and the universe. So if you believe in these sorts of things, then aspects of the universe, like the sun, the moon, the stars and the planets, through the notions of astrology, could affect human beings. Reciprocally, we can affect the universe. So there is a sort of a reciprocity there between human beings and the universe. Magic, I would argue, in distinction to Tyler, lives together with science and religion. There's no necessity to choose one over the other. Human history doesn't move from one to the other. And so if I've defined magic as participation in the universe, I would define religion fairly straightforwardly as a belief in something transcendent, a single god or many gods, some sort of spiritual realm beyond the human. And science gives us or encourages in us an objective view of the world, a world view that allows us to understand the universe as a series of forces and mass and so on, that can be appreciated through mathematical, through abstract means. And what I would say is that each of these three elements of human belief do quite different things. We're connected to the universe through magic. We have a notion of awe and transcendence through religion. And we have a sort of practical, technical grasp of the world through science. And these are deeply intertwined and intertangled. We shouldn't, I didn't spend too much worrying about boundaries between one and the other, but that each of them are elements of human life, past and present. And the bit that's been left out consistently in writing human history has been the history of magic. And therefore, to write a full history of human being, I've said that we should understand these three as being in a sort of triple helix: magic, religion and science. Each has a history, each has a cultural basis, each has a role to play. Science in particular has run something of a propaganda campaign, quite a successful propaganda campaign against magic. This is Newton, the quintessential, the original scientist in some ways, busy here thinking about optics, gravity, mathematics, a whole range of things. But Maynard Keynes said of Newton that he wasn't the first of the scientists, he was the last of the magicians. And Newton spent a lot of time engaged in alchemy. Rather wonderfully, in his rooms in Trinity College in Cambridge, he had two different furnaces where he was trying to turn lead into gold. Try and getting those past the Health and Safety Committee these days. And for Newton, there wasn't a bit of his brain that thought science and a bit that thought magic. He was interested in something like a grand theory of everything, where he could include his belief in God, biblical prophecy, alchemy, together with, entropy, gravity, optics, all of these sorts of things in the one domain. So certainly for Newton, there was no need to choose between the three. And this is a wonderful sketch that he did of the Philosopher's Stone. he was looking for some sort of substance that would allow one to transform substances into whatever you wanted. In his case, things like lead into gold. And he was quite serious that underlying the variety of matter, there might be something like a philosopher's stone that had the properties of all matter in condensed form. This is a slightly earlier magician. This is John Dee, one of my favourite people. He's engaged in showing an action to Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I first supported him. He set the propitious date for her coronation. She used him and his magic as a weapon against the Armada, obviously extremely successfully. And Dee, through his assistant, who you can see just behind him on the right of this slide, Edward Kelly, talked to angels and spirits and was to both affect the universe and gain secret knowledge of past, present, and future through his ability to talk to spiritual beings. He was very much involved in astrology as well, and almost came up 100 years before Newton, almost came up with a theory of gravity, because he was wondering how the planets and stars and so on could influence human beings astrologically, and posited a force. He didn't quite have the maths that Newton subsequently did, so never formalized it into a theory of gravity. But again, I mean, he's someone we would classify as a magician, but there are definite elements of scientific practice in his work. Just a couple of what I'll do in this lecture is give you some general thoughts about magic, and then a very sort of whistle-stop world tour. But just a couple of odd things. This is the translation of there's lots of weird and wonderful stuff once you get into magic. This is the translation of a Chinese book, and the patterns on the left-hand side of the 2 pages are tea leaves in the bottom of your cup, and the words tell you what they mean, and they mean very sort of general things. You will be much loved, but then there's really quite specific things like you will become interested in the Navy. So your teacups and your tea leaves could potentially tell you all sorts of different things if you know how to read them. And this is the first known use of the word abracadabra. So in the triangle on the bottom right there, you might be able to work out that there's the word abracadabra. At the top of the triangle, it's written in full. And as the triangle narrows, it loses a letter. And the idea was that it could act as a cure for a disease, like malaria, for instance. And as you reduce the size of the word abracadabra, the effect of the disease would lessen. So there's a lot of play in magic and with words and their not just their meanings, but also their forms. So just a few sort of general things about magic. Magic has, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but has a whole series of aims, fairly regularly recurring things that are part of magic across the world, across time and space. So magic attempts to protect people, the evil eye and those sorts of things. Magic helps you tell the future. You can use divination or various forms. Well, I'll talk about some of these in a few minutes. People are also obviously extremely interested in diagnosing the past, why something happened and what its occurrence, what its effects are in the present and future. So understanding what's happened to you and why, and therefore potentially what you can do about it, is an important part of magic. There's what I've called, slightly unsatisfactorily, relationship work, which is maintaining relationships with crucial others, whether those others be your reindeer herd, the spirits of the landscape, your nearest and dearest, a whole range of different things. There are forms of magic often associated, say, with shamanism, where the spirit causes of various good and bad things can both be investigated and put right. There's a lot of worry, understandably, about sickness, health, and possession in many cultural contexts where people didn't have a notion of germ theory. Then people getting sick was often to do with possession by spirits or getting in the wrong standing with spirits. So in making people well, there was often a sort of, exorcising the demons or getting the spirits out. There's a big element. This is where things like alchemy come in, understanding and affecting transformation. And famously, smiths around the world are often, metal smiths are often have magical practices and use magic as part of their iron smelting or bronze casting or whatever it happens to be, and can use these magical powers in other areas of their lives. There's a lot of emphasis on death, what it means to die, what it means to be dead, how to get people to stay dead. There's love magic, manipulating desire, getting people to fall in love with you, occasionally getting people to leave you alone. And I've listed all these as benign magic. They're sort of good things. And part of my argument is that magic has had a bad rap, really. But actually, the good purposes of magic often outweigh the bad, and the malign aims of magic, sorcery and harms, curses, inversions, so-called black magic, taking the Catholic mass and doing it backwards, as it were. These sorts of things are definitely for bad purposes, but they're relatively rare compared with the more benign, the more positive elements of magic. Technologies of magic, I mean, again, this is by no means exhaustive, but just to give you some notion, there's, as we saw with abracadabra, there's an emphasis on words, written and spoken, spells, curses, protective forms. As archaeologists know, in many parts of the world, particularly places like Europe, deliberate deposition of objects and other things across the landscape are important, often in gifts to spiritual presences, gods, whatever. There are modes of divination, speaking to the gods, speaking to the ancestors, speaking to the powers that be. In various formalized ways. There are oracles. The Oracle of Delphi was much consulted by ordinary people and the great and the good to try and find out if wars were going to go well or that the harvest was going to be all right. And then there are material means of harm, protection and cure. So you can use various substances to harm people, to protect them, to cure them. There are more monumental forms of construction. You can build large things. You can construct your houses in various ways as means of achieving positive ends or fending off negative ones. Again, with what we might call shamanism. Shamanism is an extraordinarily tricky term, but shamans and others engage in altered states of consciousness through fasting, drug taking, dance, whatever, in order to talk to other areas, other aspects of reality. And one that I'll talk about a little bit, then we can also see modes of art, not just as fine aesthetics and representations, but means of dealing with spiritual problems. And we can see a whole series. I mean, this is the history of magic in however many lines. We can see magic as having a relationship with other elements of human belief. So in some parts of the world, in some times, magic is the dominant force. So in the pre-Chalcolithic Middle East, prehistoric Europe and the steppe, Aboriginal Australia, North America, much of South America, magic is the dominant force. Everyone believes in it, and what we might call religion or science take a sort of lesser role. Many areas of the world emphasize magic and human lineages. So China, a lot of magic is to do with interceding with the ancestors, and similarly in many parts of Africa. And then more historically, again, there are areas where magic and religion are intertangled and equal. Places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, ancient India, medieval Europe obviously had well developed notions of religion, but equally everyone believed in magic as well. So there was a slightly ambiguous, uneasy, but constant relationship between magic and religion. And then as time goes by, in some areas, religion becomes dominant and magic much more ambiguous. So ancient Israel, Greece and Rome. And then the world that most of us inhabit, which is historically and culturally unusual, where culturally science is dominant, then religion, and then magic. And although they all exist, science is seen as the road to understanding and manipulating reality, and magic not. And magic has both models of success. How do you judge whether something's been successful? Equally important, explanations of failure, just as all elements of human life do. I mean, science is good at explaining its failures as well as its successes. And an important part of magic, which is quite different to, say, Tyler's view, which was of an inert substrate of belief that persisted through time. I would say that magic is often extremely experimental, changeable. People try out new things. This didn't quite work, so let's try it that way. So rather than something that's just inherited, people are always playing around with magic. Okay, so that's just some sort of general thoughts to get us going. Now, as I say, I'll take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and there are things that interest me, so, and hopefully some of them at least will interest you. This is the so-called Lion Man, and he's known as a Lion Man because he does have a penis, from Stedel Cave in Germany, 40,000 years old. This is a carving from mammoth ivory. It's so some aspects of it are human. It's hard to see in this particular, but the arms are very definitely human. And you might also be able to work out that it's got a lion's head. So this is a carving which combines three sets of creatures which we would consider to be separate: the mammoth, from which the ivory comes, the human, which is part of the figure, and the lion, which is part of the figure. Now, who knows what they were doing 40,000 years ago? They definitely weren't dividing the species up in ways that we were dividing them. We would divide them up. And also there's a possibility that the capacities of each of these, the mammoth, the lion and the human, through this figure are mixed and merged and matched. And therefore you could do things with a figure like this that would be impossible if you kept various species and their capabilities separate. I'll leap forward now in time to the so-called Fertile Crescent, and this in Robin's rendering of it, this looks like some sort of floating island, which is fantastic, but it's in fact a pit from a site called Hills on Tachet, near the Sea of Galilee. It's the 10th century BC. It's a reconstruction of a burial, and you might be able to see there's the body of an older woman around the top half of the pit. She has a whole series of tortoise shells in there, maybe to be eaten, maybe they were eaten, maybe not. There's the wingtip of a golden eagle, there's the tail of a leopard, there's an extra human foot, always useful, and who knows, again, and quite a number of other things, combining species, combining the various forms. And again, who knows quite what was happening here, but there seems to be a play with capacities, with different species, with different properties of things. And the human figure, the lady who was in her 40s, so presumably a sort of slightly advanced age for the time and place, is part of this assemblage, and may well have been part of forms of manipulation of these various different species 10,000 years ago. Just a sort of a thought-provoking vignette of a whole combination of different things. We're now moving slightly to the north, to present-day Turkey. No lecture at all would be complete without some mention of Gobekli Tepe. This is this extraordinary site at the south end of Turkey, created around 9000 BC. On the left hand of this slide is a plan. The right hand side is an aerial photo, and what you can see in both are a series of circular stone constructions, a whole series of stone circles with benches and pillars and so on. This gives you a slightly more oblique angle, so you can see at the bottom there's a stone circle with a whole series of large pillars and a bench around the edge of the circle. This is one of the pillars. These are enormous pillars. They weigh up to 60 tons, were transported several kilometers from where they were quarried, so a lot of effort went into these things. What you can't see, unfortunately, on this slide is the piece at the top, the sort of cross piece. At the very front, there's a schematized human head. Down the side of the pillar, which you may or may not be able to work out, don't know if you can see my cursors, there's an arm, and at the front here it meets as that there's two arms which meet as hands, and there's a belt that hangs down with various things hanging from it. So there's good reason to believe that these were humans in the form of stone. And many of the humans are combined with, generally speaking, with unpleasant, fierce animals, with snakes, with spiders, with scorpions, a whole series of things. The excavator of this site, Gobekli Tepe, said these were the world's first temples. Who knows, might be. But by and large, the stone circles are extremely small. You could only get half a dozen people in or so. There's no evidence particularly that we can see of things like deities, although maybe the spiders and the snakes are those. I prefer to see this as a series of magical practices where these stone humans, who knows quite what they are, ancestor figures, are combined with these various other fierce animals, manipulations of various different forms. There's evidence of consumption of food and drink. And when the site was abandoned, what had been carefully curated and kept evidence of feasting was piled over the top on this huge mound. So Gobekli Tepe for a long time wasn't recognized as a human mound because it was so large and had so much stuff heaped on it. So there was what we might see as the active phase, the construction, the use of these things, and then the feasting, and then people piling up the evidence of their feasting. And we can imagine these were hunter-gatherers, people coming together over relatively large areas and carrying out a series of manipulative practices which again combine humans and various different animals, food and drink, in ways that I would see as participatory, as manipulating aspects, important aspects of their world. We're leaping now across the world, and this photograph is courtesy of my friend Jessica Rawson. This is Fu Hao's tomb from the Shang dynasty of the late Bronze Age in China, roughly 1200 BC. And in the middle of the tomb, there's a sort of slightly reddish area, which would have been Fu Hao's coffin, and round the edge, pardon me, are a series of bronze of extremely elaborate bronze vessels, most of which are to do with the consumption of food and drink in ritual forms. And you might be able to see there's a niche up here with a human skeleton in. So there's not only Fu Hao herself, but there are a whole series of other human beings who are usually thought to be her servants, her assistants. We know this is Fu Hao's tomb. Fu Hao was a queen of the Shang who we know from historical records led armies in battle, did a whole series of things. We know this is Fu Hao's tomb because the bronzes have her name on them. So they're named bronzes connected with her. Incredibly beautiful things which again often combine various different species and decorations that we might keep separate. But Fu Hao and other people who had died were objects or the targets, if you like, of divination. So this is there are two forms or two material modes of divination. You could either use the scapula of an ox, or the plastron, the undershell of a turtle, and you wrote in Chinese characters, recognizable as Chinese characters today, a question that was amenable to a yes or no answer. Will Fu Hao win in battle? Will the queen have a boy? And then you took the Bronze Age equivalent of a red hot poker and you applied it to the shell or the scapula, which would then crack. The crack would be the bone, or the shell cracking would be the voice of the ancestor, and the shape of the crack would tell you the answer to your question. So above Fu Hao's tomb would have been a temple with people carrying out feasts and forms of divination aimed at Fu Hao to get answers from her. And she, in her turn, was set up in what we would see as death, to also feast her ancestors. So there was a stratigraphy of people from the living to the recently dead to the more deeply dead. And Fu Hao was asking the further dead for their views of the world. And we have this, in good Chinese fashion, incredibly sophisticated set of links. The well-being of the living depended upon their good relationships with the dead, and the reputation of the dead depended on their ability to protect and further the interests of the living members of their lineage. So this is magic working up and down a lineage. Very little to do with gods or religion, but a lot to do with ancestral sets of connections. Leaping further back west again, we're now in Mesopotamia, where there were groups. Don't worry about this writing, it's probably too small to read. I'll tell you a bit about what it says. In ancient Mesopotamia, there were a group of people known as a Shipu. These are the word Ashipu is sometimes translated as exorcist, more often as magician, and a Shipu had a whole range of duties, from the most grand, so they could inaugurate a temple. They had a regular responsibility for bringing the statues of the gods to life through various different incantations and prayers. There were lots of rituals for the king to maintain the king's well-being. They had a lot of work to do with demons, witches and curses. This became slightly more every day. People got sick. It was to do with demonic possession, so you get the Ashipu in to help you out. And the last set of lines, these are lines taken from a particular cuneiform tablet that outlines the duties of an Ashipu. Then they had lots of things to do with rituals for protection for people going on travels or campaigns, general purification, ceremonies for the cattle pen, the sheepfold, the horse stables, the Ashipu's magic reached into all aspects of ancient Mesopotamia, from the most grand to the most everyday, and people consulted them regularly and presumably thought that they worked. And one of the longest records of what we would call astronomical observation in the world was carried out in 1st millennium BC Babylonia, where the king's watch would go every night and look at the movement of the moon, the stars, the planets, and so on, for what was for them astrological purposes. And quite, well, extremely sophisticated mathematics was developed to understand the movement, predict the movement of the planets and the stars and so on, and all to help think about the well-being and the future, the past of human beings. So shot through Mesopotamian society for many thousands of years were a whole range of forms of magic. Relatively near next door neighbours, the Egyptians. No discussion of magic would be complete without Egypt. This is a magic wand, a bit of hippo ivory, which was a protective device used in many purposes, but often in pregnancy a woman would carry something like this. And we know from historical records that Egyptians had a concept that they called Heka, H-A-K-A, which I think, not to trivialize it, is a little bit like the Force in Star Wars. This was a force that existed throughout the universe. Both the gods and humans were subject to Heka, and people were continually trying to manipulate this broad set of forces for good or for evil. And there, again, like the Ashipu, there were classes of magicians who were seen to be particularly adept at using Heka for various purposes. And this just shows you a statue, a relatively everyday statue. It's probably hard to make out, but the human figure, the statue, has an amulet around their neck, a protective device. So Egypt had a whole range of different magic, from the grandest temple magic to the most everyday, but all around this notion of force, of Heka. This is, we're now in Siberia, Iron Age Siberia, and the so-called ice tombs of Pazyryk, which are seen to fit within the broad pantheon of Celtic art. On the right-hand side there, you can see a reconstruction of what this might have looked like. These ice tombs preserve amazing amounts of organics. So the left-hand side is wood and leather. So the right-hand side shows you a human figure with a leather cap, and coming off this leather cap is this extraordinary combination of species. So the main neck and mouth is of some sort of raptor, a fierce bird. In its mouth is a deer, and coming out of its neck are things like horses in 3 dimensions, but also beautifully carved into its neck are things like geese. And below, you might be able to work out in the reconstruction there are horses' hooves and various things. So this is a human being combining a whole series of other species on its head, and these species are mixing and matching. And also, because of the amazing preservation in these tombs, there's human skin preserved which has tattoos, and many of these tattoos are things like tigers eating deer, a whole range of things, and often one animal turning into another. So again, what this isn't is a Linnaean universe where all the species are nicely separated out. This is a universe where everything gets mixed up, and presumably human power is about the manipulation of these forces, animal, plant, which presumably also have some sort of spiritual dimension to them. And the complexity of this art is not representational art in the sense it's more a part of magic and experiment, I would say. And if we go to the exact opposite end of the Scythian world, when in fact slightly beyond the Scythian world, this is a gold fish from Poland, but seen to be broadly Scythian, and it has a fairly sort of idealized quintessential fish shape. But then you might see on the upper part of its body, it's got things like lions chasing and catching deer. It's got something funny coming out of its eye. Further down on its body, there are a whole series of other fish. There are rams in its tail. There's just this amazing combination of animal species. And once again, people are playing around in what, I mean, it's an overused word, but in what I would say is a sort of an animistic universe, a universe in which things are active, things have spiritual dimensions, nothing's quite what it seems, and maybe many of these creatures, which seem to us to be other species, had human dimensions to them. We'll leap further south to classical Greece. The Greeks had a whole series of wonderful magicians, people who were seers, oracle collectors. I'm not quite sure how you collect an oracle, but there you go. Singers of incantations, those who performed wonders, those who could interpret wonders, specialists in raising the souls of the dead, the root cutters, who were presumably something like, chemists and doctors, but also had a magical aspect to them. So the Greeks obviously had an extremely well developed religion, pantheon of gods, but slightly less obviously had an extremely well developed magic. And these two, magic and religion, had a slightly ambiguous, sometimes tense relationship, but they lived together, and not only did everyone believe in the gods, but also everyone believed in magic. So there was no mutual exclusion between the two. These were two parts of the Greek world, and equally we can see the origins of what much later on we call science, coming out of the works of Aristotle in particular, but a whole series of other Greek thinkers and philosophers. So there's all three elements of the triple helix in different combinations alive and well in the Greek world. And this is a cursed tablet, in fact, from the Roman world, but as many Roman things were borrowed from the Greeks, and the Romans were extremely strong on cursing, trying to do each other down, and things like chariot races, where there were two teams. There was often magic and counter magic. There you'd be trying to harm the horses and the chariots of the team that you were opposed to, but bolster and protect your team. And a lot of money was bet on chariot races, so magic was used not just in sort of a frivolous way, but to gain you money and make sure your team won. Moving towards the present and back towards the Western, well, back into the Western world. This is a 17th century depiction of a house under attack by demons, house in Tedworth in Wiltshire, and there's a very prominent set of magics to do with from the medieval period right through the modern period to protect buildings, particularly the domestic house and the church, and things like chimneys, windows, doorways were obviously vulnerable aspects of the house and the church. Your demons could get down the chimney if you weren't careful. So there were a whole series of protective devices. These things are known generically as hexafoils, and the idea, as far as we understand it, was that many people thought that demons could easily become transfixed by a line. So a demon would follow a line, and if the line had no end, the demon couldn't stop following it. So if you put something like a hexafoil on your mantelpiece next to the fireplace, then that would prevent the demon, if it did get out, getting further out into the room. And one of these interesting perceptual things, in the last few years, people have realized quite how prevalent these hexafoils are, that there are literally thousands of them in churches and domestic spaces in places like Britain. And when places like America and Australia and New Zealand were colonized by Europeans, then these magics went with them. So you can find 19th century versions of hexafoils in barns in central Tasmania, in Pennsylvania, in the South Island of New Zealand. So these things were very prevalent, and people took them with them. In ways that we're still only just starting to understand. The other thing that people did was next to chimney cavities. So there are cavities next to the chimney breast in this house. People would throw things, creating what archaeologists have come to call spiritual middens. So this is one from a house in Norfolk, which is made up of a whole series of miscellaneous stuff, shoes, clothing, bits of furniture, a whole range of different things, which built up over several centuries and had some sort of stratigraphy and in the void next to the chimney, and are seen as part of the protections of the house, part of the means of keeping out demons. So magic comes through back to our onions in the 19th century, and definitely through into the 20th century. And there are now apps, as I'm sure many of you know, for astrology. Magic is becoming digital in the 21st century, and magic, as I said at the beginning, magic morphs and changes, so stays alive and stays responsive to the needs and the technologies of the time. One of the things that I'm interested in is how far we can renovate a notion of magic for the 21st century. So my thoughts are something like this. If you follow my definition of magic as participation in the universe, then there is a connection between human beings and the universe, which is a very close one. And it can become seen as a connection of relationship, of kinship, and with kinship comes care and responsibility. So a magical sensibility not only has the sort of practical aspects, it has a more moral dimension, and there are elements, and this, as a humble archaeologist, is way above my pay grade. There are elements of the more out there aspects of modern science that are not so far away from magical beliefs. So these are two representations of two entangled particles, subatomic particles, which when they, and this is a well recognized phenomenon, I understand, where the spin or the polarity of one changes, it will do so in the other. And these changes occur faster than light can move from one to the other. So there's no means at the moment within physics of explaining entanglement, and probably, for want of a better term, physicists have started talking about these particles as being conscious of each other. So if the basic building blocks of the universe, subatomic particles, can be seen in some ways to be conscious of each other, that would fit very squarely within an animist worldview. Animists would say, well, yes, we told you so. It's taken you quite a while to catch up, but the world is not only animate, it's sentient, it's conscious. And if those things are true, it repositions our relationship with the universe. There are other elements of quantum mechanics which says that the observer does influence the action of subatomic particles. So something, people like us who we would consider living can influence things that we would consider not living in ways that we don't at all understand. And I think in the ecological crisis of the present, we need to rethink our relationship with the world and the universe, and a notion of kinship, responsibility and care could be crucial, and magic could help us give us that, rather than adopting anybody else's magic, which I don't think is feasible. Maybe we could start to think of how we can invent magics of our own with the help of subatomic physics and a whole range of other things, which would reset our relationship with the world in a much more benign and useful manner. And just to end with a shameless plug, if you're not too turned off by all of this, here's the book of the talk, available at all good bookshops. So I hope it is anyway. And thank you very much indeed for watching and listening. And I think, Robin, this will be available. This talk will be available on the School of Archaeology website. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I will be putting it there.
Thank you so much, Chris. We would all normally clap, so we're all clapping in our individual rooms.
Thank you very much. I could hear it.
Brilliant. So root cutters, spiritual middens, there's a lot for us to pick over here, and I would invite now questions from the audience.
Stunned into silence. I can see a hand, Amy. I don't know.
Ah, please do. Yeah.
If you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your fascinating lecture. I do have a question. Do you believe that there is any worth in applying a distinction between magic as it pertains to religious and other forms of magic? The distinction being wherein one may supplicate to some other supernatural force or being in order to achieve a specific goal, as opposed to achieving this specific goal through the inherent will, power, knowledge, or skill of the practitioner.
Sorry, I think a demon has possessed my laptop, so I couldn't really hear that very clear. I don't know if anybody else could.
I'll try and put it in the chat.
Yes,
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, Chris.
Okay, yep.
Campbell Martin is asking, let me just scroll down here. Hi. Do you have an opinion about magic as a response to colonialism or cultural stress?
Yes, very good. Well, there are quite well developed magics to resist colonialism. So in Sumatra, which was incorporated into Dutch Indonesia, there were all sorts of magics to protect the resistance fighters against the Dutch, to make their clothing into armor, for instance, so that Dutch bullets wouldn't be able to injure them. So there are quite a lot of instances of colonial forms of resistance through magic, and there are almost certainly a whole range of forms of sorcery that people tried to practice and perpetrate against the colonizers with who knows, with maybe varied success. But no, it's a good question.
And we have, Owen has now put the question in the chat. It's
right.
Do you believe that there is any worth in applying a distinction between magic as it pertains to religious cult and other forms of magic, wherein one may supplicate to some other supernatural force or being in order to achieve a specific goal, as opposed to achieving this specific goal through the inherent will, power, knowledge, or skill of the practitioner?
Okay, yeah. So getting the gods to help you. I mean, there are all sorts of ambiguities. Keith Thomas, in his Religion and the Decline of Magic, said that the Catholic Church was a fantastic reservoir of magical power. And presumably that power partly derived from God in some way, although the church was always quite ambiguous. I haven't gone there, making that sort of distinction. But I think you could in many different ways. I just think, for me at least, if you get too sort of entangled in small categorizations and the ambiguous links between magic and religion, or indeed magic and science, then you can go slightly bananas. But that was just my thought.
Victoria, did I see you have your hand up?
I did. It was quite a similar question of sort of how useful do you necessarily see the distinction of religion and magic? Sort of at what point do you think there is a firm line, or do you think it's very much a permeable, time dependent, location dependent issue?
Yeah, no, definitely permeable, and things like miracles. Many saints, their reputation was based on miraculous healing or whatever it happens to be, and almost certainly that the power of the miracle, the efficacy of the miracle came from God, but people would go to the statue of the Virgin Mary or whoever it happened to be in order to get the miracle, what I would think of as magic, to work. So I think there are lots of ambiguous cases, but I think there's enough separation ultimately between religion, which is definitely to do with a single god or many gods, and magic, which is a much more sort of diffuse participatory notion, links with the world and its spirits.
And Sarah Heaper, hi Sarah, has said, I'm curious about magic methods, practices, and cultural appropriation versus appreciation.
Ah, yes. Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So I don't know if any of you, most people in the audience are probably too young to know of a man called Carlos Castaneda, who wrote a whole series of best-selling books in the 70s and 80s, and he claimed to have been a Latino American, as it were, but he claimed to have been the apprentice of a Yaqui, the sort of native magician, and these books were full of what he'd learnt from his master. But then many Native Americans from the New Mexico area got extremely upset about this, which they saw as cultural appropriation. There's never been any evidence that he was actually apprenticed to anyone, and probably read various ethnographies and made a huge amount of money out of his books in the 70s and 80s. So there's a lot of anger amongst indigenous people about misappropriations of their magic, and quite right too.
James Hicks talks about the craftsmanship of the objects that you've been showing, and asks, could you please comment on the aesthetic or effective aspects of those magical material forms, particularly the role and importance of craftsmanship and its role in the process of magical transformation?
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent question, and the sort of thing I thought about loads. So we think of craft as physical, technical skill, fine motor skills in our hands, and appreciation of the material, and it's clearly all of that. but many people, possibly most people, think that there's a sort of extra human, extra material dimension, so that, you know, smiths may go through rites of purification, fasting, abstinence from sex, a whole range of different things in order to be in the right sort of participatory, broadly, connections with the spirits. So I think crafts are often to do with what we would call as magic, and those art forms. I mean, I think art's a terrible word in many ways, because that sort of the wooden piece on the top of the cap from Pazyryk, that is a piece of experiment, I would say. I mean, it's extraordinarily skilled and beautiful, but it was playing around with various relationships. So we tend to think of art as sort of, you know, slightly passive when we go to a gallery and walk around and then walk out. But I think many of these things were experimental and part of general attempts to change the world.
And Lanshi asks, how do we differentiate magic from folklore or ritual, especially in countries like China and Japan? People are increasingly referring to Shinto and also ancestral worship as ritual rather than magic, making the boundaries blurred.
Yeah. Well, I think often one of the reasons I like the word magic is a lot of people don't like it. It's got a degree of controversy around it because it's often seen as illegitimate, false belief. But I think a word, for me, I mean, I can't comment on anybody else's use of these words, but for me, a term like ritual doesn't have a great deal of content, whereas magic has a slightly more cutting edge. And for me, it's a ritual is a magical ritual if it's to do with these sort of participatory forms, connecting with your ancestors, connecting with the spirits of the world or whatever, that then makes a ritual magical. Obviously there are lots of rituals which are, you know, purely secular, as it were, and even more which are most obviously religious, to do with God or gods. But so I prefer the term magic to ritual, because I think it has a bit more sort of substance and content and a bit more to argue about.
Julia Kotas, is there any specific geographic region where magic, in broad terms, still fulfills a prominent role during our day?
Everywhere, I would say. I don't think there's anywhere where magic isn't prominent, and I think you know, all of us, possibly to some degree, have some element of magical belief. I mean, I think there are areas of the world where, you know, I worked in New Guinea for ages, and I think most people are Christian, but everyone believes in the spirits of the ancestors, particular good and bad spirits of place. There are things that you can't do in particular places because of the spirits. There are places you can't go at all. So I think there are areas of the world where people are more, you know, sort of wholehearted about their magic. But I don't see anywhere where people don't, you know, a number of, not everyone, but quite a number of people embrace magical beliefs.
Thank you. Mark Pollard asks, how do you think that the importance of magic in previous other societies should affect archaeological interpretation?
Yeah, well, I don't think we've thought enough about it. So I mean, I think an attempt at interpretation is an imaginative attempt to enter other people's universes, and because other people's universes are constructed to reasonable degree around magic, then we need to you know, to take that into account. It's you know, a particular interpretation, say, of the lion figure at Stedel or wherever, is tricky, impossible. But I mean, not to think about its potential magical properties at all, I think is to miss a lot out. And Mark and I have had quite a lot of, well, no, lots and lots of discussions about the nature of technology and how, you know, if it's purely seen as technology and technical, you know, how much tin do you put with your copper in order to make bronze or whatever, which is, you know, obviously important. But the people doing these things in the Bronze Age had a whole series of other thoughts in mind, which were presumably a lot more magical than you know, our common sense would allow for.
Well, Chris, I think we're all glad we've had the opportunity to enter your universe for a while. To use that phrase that you've explained to us. And I'm delighted to say that this event is the first in a series of opportunities we'll have to celebrate books that are coming out. And I believe that one of the upcoming publications is the publication of Shadrach Chirikure's book on Great Zimbabwe, Reclaiming a Confiscated Past, which will be published by Routledge on the 30th of November. And so please look out for future communications of talks, including Shadrach Chirikure's talk. And thanks again to Robin for keeping everything going and doing such a great job with the chat and the lobby. And thanks above all to Chris.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.